How are you?
Set up?
Get in there.
Yeah. I'm Mitch.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Scott.
I'm Scott.
Hi.
And Chris and Liz.
Hi.
Hello.
Reach.
I'd heard to take a picture.
Yeah.
All set?
Yeah.
Yep. And what are your thoughts on U.S. and Venezuelan relations? And what are the major factors that are causing the tensions between the two countries?
Well, the U.S.-Venezuelan relations go back a long time. I mean, the main go back into the 19th century, but the major point was around 1920, when Venezuela was a British protectorate, effectively, and by the First World War, it was beginning to become clear that oil was going to be really important for military, for the Navy, for the economy, and so on. So Woodrow Wilson kicked the British out of Venezuela. Woodrow Wilson, as we were taught in school about Wilsonian idealism, which is supposed to be a deep feature of American history. Woodrow Wilson was one of the most brutal interventionists among the American presidents. I mean, places like Haiti have never recovered from his invasion, and others in the hemisphere was similar. In the case of Venezuela, he just kicked the British out. The U.S. was powerful enough to do it by that time, and supported a miserable, brutal dictator, Gomez, because he made deals with to allow U.S. energy companies to go in and exploit Venezuelan oil, and without going into the details, so it continues. I mean, some of the worst monsters were greatly honored here, for example, by the Eisenhower administration, to give Medal of Honor to the vicious dictator they had. And that's pretty much the history. The Venezuelan resources go well beyond oil. I mean, it was some iron, others. And yes, it was a bonanza for American corporations. Didn't do anything for the Venezuelan people. Did a lot for the Venezuelan elite, who live very well and naturally hate Chavez because he's changing things. That's the history of, I mean, it goes up and back to vacillation, but that's fundamentally the history. Venezuela had a role in the U.S. system of, after the Second World War, global domination. Before the Second World War, regional domination, and it played a big role. Right now, if you look at U.S. intelligence projections, one of the main ones was the year 2000. This is Clinton still. The National Intelligence Council gave projections for the next, I think, 15 or 20 years. And a lot of it had to do with control over oil, which is crucially important. They took for granted the U.S. must control the Middle East oil supplies, which are by far the largest in the world, so the U.S. to control them. But that the U.S. itself would rely on more stable resources, Atlantic Basin resources, which means West Africa and the Western Hemisphere. And of these, because that's just more secure, Europeans and Japanese rely on the Middle East oil, which we'll control because we have to have a lever of world control, but we won't use that much. Well, of the Atlantic Basin resources, the main ones are Venezuela. So when Venezuela stopped being a loyal client state, the U.S. became pretty upset. They don't care about dictators. I mean, they supported and are supporting much. Whatever you think about Chavez, he's nothing like the people who the U.S. willingly supported and still does. But he is independent, and that's unacceptable. And he can't be intimidated, which is unacceptable. So therefore, he becomes an enemy. Since then, U.S.-Venezuelan relations have been conflicted. In 2002, the Bush administration supported a military coup, which briefly overthrew the government. Washington had to back off because, first of all, because the coup was reversed by popular uprising, but secondly, because Latin Americans were appalled. I mean, Latin Americans actually take democracy seriously. In Washington, it's just rhetoric. You talk about democracy to make yourself look good when you're doing something, but there's no evidence that they're in favor of democracy and overwhelming evidence against it. And this was an example. Latin Americans were not in favor of overthrowing an elected government by a military coup. Washington was in favor. So Washington had to kind of back off quickly, and a little embarrassment, but the media are polite. They don't embarrass power, so it kind of passed. But immediately, right after that, the U.S. moved to the next step, subversion. Subversion, means, we know how that's done. It's done through the National Endowment of Democracy, after all. This is the age of Orwell. So the National Endowment of Democracy is dedicated to undermining democracy. U.S. aid has what are called democracy promotion programs, many of which are dedicated to undermining democracy. U.S. aid will probably be folded into the State Department so that it fits what are called officially our democracy promotion objectives more fully. Won't be involved in development, but anyone who knows, who doesn't just, if we're in North Korea, if we insist on being North Koreans, then the declarations of the dear leader are true. But if we decide to use our brains, nobody pays attention to the declaration of leaders, no matter who they are. You look at the practices, and the practices are quite the opposite. So what's called democracy promotion in Venezuela is openly described as support for the anti-Chavez, pro-democracy groups. The principle is if you're for Chavez, you can't be for democracy. So the large majority of Venezuelan people must be against democracy because they're in favor of democracy and support Chavez. Now, that's our Orwellian doctrinal system. But the aid, the assistance, goes primarily to groups that are trying to overthrow the Chavez government. That's called support for democracy. The fact that this is tolerated in the United States is quite interesting.